Hello everyone and welcome to the Hockey Hub. I'm Brennan and today we're doing another team preview and we're looking at the Vancouver Canucks. The Vancouver Canucks turned a lot of heads in the bubble. They were able to make it to the second round of the playoffs, beating the Minnesota Wild, St. Louis Blues, and then putting up a tough fight against the Vegas Golden Knights. That being said, Thatcherdemko was kind of the main reason why they were able to put up a fight against Vegas, taking it all the way to Game 7 but then losing in that Game 7. I do think that previous to this offseason, Vancouver was probably the best Canadian team on paper, but they did lose a lot this offseason. That being said, they have done an admirable job of trying to recoup some of those losses by some of their signings and trades, and we're going to look at what they added. Now to start off, Vancouver made a good depth signing in Jace Hawryluk. Hawryluk is probably a good fourth line forward or maybe an extra forward. I do think that this just kind of helps shore up their forward depth. I don't think that Hawryluk is going to be an impact player for Vancouver, but that being said, getting him on a cheap one-year contract I think is a good pickup for the Vancouver Canucks. They also recently signed Travis Hamonic to a professional tryout, and as of the time that I'm recording this video, he hasn't signed a contract yet, but it is believed that he is going to get probably a lower contract, 1 year, probably around 1.5 million AAV, once they get Michael Furlan's contract put on the LTIR. So I do think that getting Hamonic is, a decent replacement for Tanev. I don't think that Hamonic is as good as Tanev, but we'll get into that later. Hamonic can bring a good defensive presence and a physical game to the Vancouver Canucks, but that being said, you can't really expect a lot of offense from Hamonic. Hamonic is no real offensive superstar, obviously. Over a 56-game schedule, he's probably only going to get you around 10 points, but that being said, you're definitely looking for more of the defensive side from Hamonic. But then two big additions for the Vancouver Canucks is the likes of Braden Holtby. Now, Braden Holtby was one of the best goaltenders in the NHL for a while playing for the Washington Capitals, but these past two seasons he's kind of fell off the map a little bit, really just put up average to bad numbers in all honesty these past few years, and was succeeded by Ilya Samsonov, the young goaltender in Washington. If Holtby can somewhat bounce back to the form we saw as early as 3 seasons ago, then Holtby can be a really good pickup for the Vancouver Canucks. I do think that Holtby is capable of being a top 10 goaltender in the league, but if he ends up playing like how he has these past few seasons, the signing isn't going to look great for Vancouver this one season, since he's likely to be taken by Seattle after this year. But I guess that does depend on whether or not Holtby has a good year. But then to me, Vancouver's big addition was getting Nate Schmidt for a 3rd round draft pick. That is an absolute steal. Nate Schmidt has been a top pairing blue liner for the Vegas Golden Knights since their inception, and he was still a good blue liner playing for the Washington Capitals. Nate Schmidt is good at all ends of the ice. He brings a lot offensively, he brings leadership, he brings a strong defensive game, and I think is a true top pairing blue liner. Him and Quinn Hughes could make for one of the best pairings in the NHL, as long as Nate Schmidt fits in well in the Vancouver system. But either way, getting Nate Schmidt for as cheap as they did, I understand that his contract does run a little long, but that being said, Nate Schmidt is definitely worth it now. But when you talk about the subtractions for the Vancouver Canucks, this is where things start to look ugly. They did lose Josh Leivo, and I think a lot of people saw this coming. Leivo was injured for a predominant part of the year this past season, and I personally didn't see them re-signing him. Leivo was pretty okay for Vancouver in the short amount of time that he played there, but Leivo is no superstar, probably more like a bottom 6 forward, and I don't think that Leivo is a big loss for the Vancouver Canucks. They also chose not to qualify Troy Stetcher, as his qualifying offer would have been a bit rich for Vancouver's blood. Troy Stetcher has been a solid bottom pairing defender for the Vancouver Canucks. Sometimes he's played higher in the lineup, and he was a guy that you could really tell he loved being a Canuck. So it's kind of a shame that he ended up leaving Vancouver and signing in Detroit. Stetcher was kind of a fan favorite for a while there, and I think he is going to be missed by Vancouver. He was a solid all-around defenseman and had some pretty big moments for them in the playoffs. But then they do have some pretty sizable losses in the likes of Tyler Toffoli, Chris Tanev, and Jacob Markstrom. Now, Tyler Toffoli was brought in at the trade deadline and only played 10 regular season games for the Vancouver Canucks, and I believe that he only suited up for 7 playoff games as well since he was dealing with an injury. That being said, in those 10 regular season games for the Vancouver Canucks, Toffoli was simply fantastic. He put up 10 points in 10 games, 6 goals, and he was one of their best offensive players, if not their best for that 10-period span. I do think that Toffoli fit in well in Vancouver, and it's kind of baffling to me why they chose not to re-sign him, considering the bargain contract that he signed in Montreal. I do think that Tyler Toffoli's presence is going to be missed, and considering what they had to give up, a draft pick, Tyler Madden, who is a good prospect now for the LA Kings, I do think that trade has kind of backfired on Jim Benning a little bit, since they weren't able to keep him. Toffoli was good in the games that he played for Vancouver, but now they kind of lost him for nothing after giving up all those pieces for him. Chris Tanev has been a guy who just feels like he should have probably retired a Vancouver Canuck. It is going to be very odd seeing him in a Calgary jersey, because Canuck has been in Vancouver for what feels like forever. Vancouver. He was part of those good teams in the earlier part of the decade with the Sedins, and he was kind of expected to be a guy that they could lean on, look for leadership as they head into this new era of contention with guys like Elias Patterson and Quinn Hughes. But the Vancouver really didn't end up putting out an offer there for Tanev, as he ended up signing in Vancouver. I think that Tanev's defensive presence is definitely going to be missed for Vancouver, and I think his leadership and just how long he's been around the team, I think he's going to be missed as well. Although Tanev does struggle with injuries, he was able to stay healthy this season for the most part, and I do get that he's older, so maybe it was the right decision not signing him, but I still think that Tanev is going to be missed for the first 2 years or so. And then Jacob Markstrom was the big loss for the Vancouver Canucks. Getting Braden Holtby does help offset this loss a little bit, and then you've got Thatcherdemko as well. But Jacob Markstrom has been simply sensational for the Vancouver Canucks these past few seasons. I honestly believe that Jacob Markstrom should have been a Vezina nominee this past year, and I do think he finished 4th in Vezina voting, though. Jacob Markstrom was one of the best goalies in the league. He was always fun to watch and kept Vancouver in their games night in and night out. I know that his numbers weren't amazing and fantastic. He put up a .917 save percentage, but that doesn't speak to how well Markstrom played for Vancouver. If you watch the games, you could tell, the Vancouver Canucks defense gave up a lot of shots, and Markstrom was able to fight most of those off and keep them in it and give them wins, and I think he was honestly probably their most valuable player this past season. Markstrom was also really good in the playoffs against the Minnesota Wild and St. Louis Blues. Things kind of fell off a little bit against the Vegas Golden Knights, but he was dealing with an injury, so that makes sense. I do get that Vancouver chose not to re-sign him because he wanted a no-movement clause, which for the Seattle expansion draft coming soon, that really wouldn't work for them. So I do get why Vancouver chose to move on from Jacob Markstrom and pick up a guy like Braden Holtby, but that being said, Holtby is still a downgrade from Markstrom. If Holtby is able to bounce back and if Markstrom struggles a bit in Calgary, it will look like a genius move, but for now, Markstrom is a colossal loss for the Vancouver Canucks. Thankfully for Vancouver, they still boast a really good and really young top six. Now, there is some weaknesses in this top six, as I think Jake Virtanen probably slots in here. Jake Virtanen had a good regular season, being on a 20-goal pace, but in the playoffs it kind of fell apart. Jake Virtanen feels like a guy who isn't long for Vancouver. He's constantly in trade rumors, and there has been reports of attitude issues and kind of work ethic issues, and I don't think he's a guy that's going to stick around long-term in Vancouver. Virtanen was a high draft pick and was thought of to be a great power forward for the Vancouver Canucks, but it hasn't really happened just yet. Virtanen does have one more season to maybe prove something, but I'm not sure if he's going to be able to. Getting a top six role will maybe help him, or it might just show that he's not really ready or ever going to be a true top six power forward winger. But then having Tanner Pearson there, I think Pearson is one of the most underrated wingers in the NHL. He brings a strong two-way game to go along with a decent amount of offense, being at a 50-point pace, and I think that Pearson, really doesn't get enough credit for what he does. A lot of guys kind of write him off and don't really think of him as a key piece for the Vancouver Canucks, but I actually do, and I think that was probably one of Jim Benning's best trades, moving out the poor contract of Eric Branson for a really good top six forward in Tanner Pearson. Tanner Pearson is likely more of a middle six forward. Ideally, you don't want him playing on your top line, but I think he fits in well there on the second line with probably Beau Horvath. And I do want to talk about Beau Horvath, as Horvath I think is one of the best younger two-way centers in the NHL. He's already a captain for the Vancouver Canucks, and he was simply great for Vancouver in their playoff run. I do definitely think that Horvath is a great second-line center, arguably a first-line center on a lot of teams, but when you have the good center depth of the Vancouver Canucks, it is, kind of an embarrassment of riches to be able to put Beau Horvath at that second line position. I do get that Horvath's offensive numbers don't always stand out, although he was great offensively in the playoffs, but that really strong two-way game is what you get from Horvath, and it's a big part of the reason why Vancouver Canucks fans love him. Horvath is effective at every end of the ice, and I do expect him to be a Vancouver Canuck for a very long time. Then getting into the top line of JT Miller, Elias Patterson, and Brock Besser. Besser's a guy who's been in trade rumors for a little bit, and it doesn't really make sense to me. I understand that he has struggled with his consistency and his injury issues, but he's still a young forward with a lot of potential. I think that he is probably going to be a consistent 30-goal scorer in his career, and those guys don't come around often. I do think that Besser has kind of taken a step forward in his playmaking abilities, but I do think that he needs to focus on shooting a little bit more, as he does have one of the best pure shots in the Vancouver Canucks. JT Miller was a great acquisition for the Vancouver Canucks as well. In his first season, he was over point per game, and was definitely one of their most valuable players. He carried that hot run into the playoffs, and while I don't think that Miller is going to be, a point per game player for throughout the entirety of his time in Vancouver, I do think that he does probably take a little bit of a step back this season. I still think that Miller is a true top 6 forward. He brings a strong two-way game, he can play center, and is a real key guy with experience and leadership for that young Vancouver team. And then there's the young superstar in Elias Patterson. I do think that Elias Patterson does get overrated sometimes. There's been people saying that he's one of the best centers in the league, which I do think that he's a great center. I'm just not sure if he's top 10 yet. And then there was a quote recently came out by somebody saying that he was the best player in Canada, and that's simply not true. That being said, Patterson is still a true first-line center, and I think is going to be an elite offensive talent for years to come. Pettersson could end up being a top 5 center at some point in his career. I don't think he's that just yet, but he definitely has the tools to be, one of the best. Actually, he brings a strong two-way game as well, so one of the best two-way centers in the league to go along with being a very dangerous offensive threat. Pettersson has got a lethal shot, but he's also a very gifted playmaker, and he's, for a young player, he's responsible in the defensive zone, but the offense is really what you're looking for from Pettersson. I do think that Pettersson is probably going to have a very big year this upcoming season, and I could see him being a guy that might actually get some MVP votes for how well he plays at all aspects of the game. When looking at the top 4 for the Vancouver Canucks, it really intrigues me. Tyler Myers was brought in on a very big contract, 5 years at $6 million, and he didn't really live up to that in his first season in Vancouver, and unfortunately I don't think a lot of people expected him to. When Myers was signed to that deal, a lot of people kind of agreed that it was a bit of an overpayment, and so far Myers has just proved those people right. Myers isn't a bad defenseman, but I don't think that he's worth the contract he's getting paid. He's getting paid like a top pairing blue liner, and I don't think that Myers is a top pairing guy. Ideally, he slots in on your second pairing there, which thankfully bringing in a guy like Nate Schmidt is going to allow Myers to play in a second pairing role where he's best suited. Same can be said for Alex Edler in the sense that he's definitely better suited in a second pairing role. Edler is getting older and he's definitely winding down his career. He was one of the key guys for Vancouver back in, their Stanley Cup final run, so it makes sense that Edler is kind of winding it down now. He's still an effective defenseman, not really a standout. He's not going to wow you with his play, but he puts up, good offensive numbers for a defenseman to go along with a pretty strong defensive game. But the top pairing is where I'm really enamored with Vancouver's blue line. Quinn Hughes and Nate Schmidt could make for one of the best top pairings in the NHL. Nate Schmidt, as we previously talked about, brings a lot at every aspect of the game. Strong defensive game, a decent physical game, and good offensive instincts for a defenseman, but Quinn Hughes is the real guy to talk about here. Quinn Hughes in his rookie year was one of the best rookie defensemen we've ever seen. He's arguably already cemented himself as one of the best defensemen Vancouver's ever seen as well. I do think that Quinn Hughes will probably end up as the best defenseman that Vancouver's ever had to this point. I think that Hughes just oozes offensive potential to go along with a good defensive game for such a young defender. I think Quinn Hughes has got serious franchise potential as an offensive blue liner, and although I do think the Calder went to the right guy in Cale Makar, Quinn Hughes was as close as you could come for a number 2. Hughes probably played in a bigger role than Makar did for Vancouver, so I do get the argument for both sides, and I don't think there was really a wrong pick. Hughes was already great in his first year, and then, to follow up that play in the playoffs, Hughes was also really good in the playoffs as well. I don't know if we're going to see a sophomore slump with Hughes. Honestly, I don't think so. I think his play in the playoffs, if we were going to see a slump from Hughes, I think it might have happened there, since that's a very high-pressure situation, and the fact of the matter is that there was so much time off between the regular season and the playoffs that, that could have created the sophomore slump, but I think that Hughes is just such a gifted and smart defenseman. He uses his stick well, his foot speed well, and his good positioning as well. So I think that Hughes is a guy Vancouver fans can look towards, for a very long time. I think Hughes is going to be one of the best defensemen in the NHL, and he arguably already is. To me, I think Vancouver might have the most interesting goaltending tandem in the NHL. They brought in Braden Holtby on a 2-year deal at $4.3 million, and I think that is a good contract for what Holtby provides. That being said, I think Holtby is probably only going to play the one season in Vancouver, as if he has a good year, I expect him to be picked up by Seattle in the expansion draft. But Thatcherdemko is the real interesting name here. Now, Thatcherdemko is a guy that we've all waited on for a long time to come in as a true starter for the Vancouver Canucks. He did play as a backup to Jacob Markstrom in the regular season and put up decent but not amazing totals. But then in the playoffs, Thatcherdemko looked completely like a different goaltender. Demko was simply sensational in the few short games he played for Vancouver, saving their asses occasion after occasion, but then finally falling in Game 7, which was no fault of Demko, as Vancouver did end up getting shut out. Demko put up like a .985 save percentage in the 3 games he played for Vancouver, which is absolutely insane. Demko was arguably the best goaltender for that short period in the playoffs and showed a lot. He was amazing, and he got Vancouver fans very excited. And I think everybody knows that Demko isn't going to be able to play like that night in and night out in the regular season, but if Demko is able to come in and look like a true starter, that is really going to make the decision easy for the Vancouver Canucks moving forward with their goaltending, and is going to make their future outlook look so much better. If Demko is able to be a true starter, and a great starter at that for Vancouver, they're going to look like an even better team and a true contender for what could be an entire decade with how young their core is. Vancouver is really going to have to count on Thatcherdemko this season, though. They do want him to have a great season, because even if Holtby ends up being the starter and Demko struggles a bit, it's still going to be a tough decision when it comes to the Seattle expansion. Holtby is older, whereas Demko is still 24, 25, so I think that ideally Vancouver wants Demko to kind of, get more of the starts, and then if Vancouver is able to make the playoffs, be the starter come playoff time. A lot of, the hopes for the Vancouver Canucks really depends on this goaltending tandem. The rest of their roster is solid, but I think, the fate of their season probably lies in this tandem. When you look at the core five for the Vancouver Canucks, it makes sense why there's so much hype around this young team. The core five is young and it's good. Brock Besser and JT Miller are two really good wingers for the Vancouver Canucks. I do think that Miller is a step ahead of Besser right now, but that being said, Besser is the younger player and does probably have a little bit more upside. I think that Miller is still going to be a solid player for Vancouver. I'm not sure if he's going to be able to be a point per game player again, but that being said, probably still going to be around there to go along with strong two-way game and leadership. I do think that Quinn Hughes has definitely already cemented himself in this spot. Hughes is one of the best offensive defensemen already after only playing 1 year, and is one of the best young blue liners, period. Quinn Hughes is going to be fantastic for Vancouver for years to come. And same can be said about Beau Horvath and Elias Patterson. Beau Horvath is one of the youngest captains in the NHL, and he's definitely earned that seat. He's been around for a while despite being a younger player. He came in, played very young, and I do think that Horvath is going to be the captain for Vancouver for a very long time. Horvath was amazing in the playoffs, definitely being the goal-scoring leader for Vancouver and scoring critical goals at that, overtime goals, shorthanded goals, game-tying goals. I think he was Vancouver's most valuable player, and it really shows why he was their captain. He leads by example, and he's a great player. And then Elias Patterson is young and great, and he's only getting better and better. I do think that Patterson is going to have a monster year this year. I honestly probably expect him to finish top 10 or maybe even top 5 in MVP voting, and I think he's probably going to be above point per game. There's a lot of hype around Patterson, and so far he has lived up to that hype, although I do think he gets, a little bit overrated sometimes. I don't think he's a top 10 center yet, but if he has a great season this year, he'll definitely put himself into that top 10 role. Now some interesting players for the Vancouver Canucks. First off, I want to talk about Loui Eriksson. Now, Loui Eriksson has kind of been a meme in the hockey community for a while. He's obviously on that massive contract, and that's been a big anchor for the Vancouver Canucks. If Eriksson wasn't there, they would have likely been able to keep Tyler Toffoli, and it's going to be interesting to see where Eriksson actually plays this year. He might end up getting sent down to Utica or playing on their taxi squad. I don't think that Eriksson is good enough to play night in and night out, and for a guy that you're paying $6 million to, it really sucks for Vancouver to have a guy who's basically a healthy scratch being paid $6 million a year. If they send him down to the AHL, they do shed about $1 million off that contract, but even then, $5 million for what Eriksson provides, it's one of the worst contracts in the NHL, and it's basically unmovable in the flat cap. But then I do want to talk about a young, intriguing prospect in Olli Juolevi. Now, Juolevi was a 5th overall pick and hasn't been able to make the NHL yet. Injuries have set Juolevi back, but he also really hasn't shown a lot at the AHL level either. That being said, Vancouver management does believe in Juolevi, and if Juolevi is able to come in on that depleted Vancouver blue line from all their losses, Juolevi actually might be able to turn some heads and have a good rookie year. I do expect Juolevi to play in that top 6 for Vancouver, and I think he's going to be a guy that they rely upon to kind of, show why he was a 5th overall pick. Bring some offense, bring a solid defensive game, and maybe cement himself as a core part of that future for the Vancouver Canucks. And then I want to talk about Adam Gaudette. Now, Gaudette is a player that I think really flies under the radar. He puts up solid offensive totals, and for a younger player, he is good in the defensive zone. I do think that he fits in as that third-line center of the future, and now for Vancouver Canucks. I do think that Gaudette is a piece that Vancouver should, lock up long-term. I don't think that he's going to demand a lot of money. They just signed him to a 1-year deal, a bridge deal, and I do think that if Vancouver can lock him up, I think they should. I think that Gaudette definitely has a lot of potential as being a middle 6 center, and I think can fit in perfectly behind Elias Patterson and Beau Horvath. As far as the category goes for the Vancouver Canucks, I would say that they are a bubble team. If it wasn't for everything that they lost, I would say that they're a contender, but honestly, I'm not sure if they make it in the Canadian division. They do have some of the best young star power in the likes of Elias Patterson, Quinn Hughes, Beau Horvath, and Besser, but I think their season is really going to depend on how their goaltending performs, in all honesty. If both Holtby and Demko are able to steal the show, they could end up winning the Canadian division. But if Holtby struggles and if Demko shows that he isn't ready, they could end up finishing 6th. I really have a hard time predicting where Vancouver's going to fall. I honestly think that they're probably the biggest wildcard in this Canadian division. I think they're going to be one of the funnest teams to watch, and I think that how they play is really going to affect how the rest of the division shakes out. Regardless of how Vancouver performs this season, I think Vancouver fans should have a lot to look forward to. Even if they have a poor season, their core is still so young and so good that I think Vancouver could be a contender for as much as a decade to come. Patterson is going to be a great player. Horvath's actually, Patterson's already a great player. Same can be said for Horvath and Hughes and Besser, and I think a guy like Miller is a perfect complementary piece to that core. So Vancouver's got a great young core, and no matter how they perform this season, I think Vancouver is going to be a really good team for many years to come. But that does it for today's video. I appreciate you guys watching till the end. Please leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you guys later. Bye for now.